So, I'm back in the UK now, and I thought that I'd do a bit of local history stuff, because there are plenty of places around near where I live which I feel have some important history that is somewhat underappreciated. Today, I am in the village of Nettleham. Today, Nettleham has about 4,000 people living in it, as of the last census. It also has all the amenities a village should have: 3 pubs, a medical centre, a couple of parks, and of course the central police station for all of Lincolnshire, which we'll go past in a moment. When it comes to the history of Nettleham, there have of course been a presence of people here for a very long time. The first evidence of settlement goes back to the Romans, where they may have set up a well here to supplement their supply of water to their main encampment at Lincoln, which is not very far away at all. However, any evidence the Romans were here is very much buried by now. After the Romans left, the Anglo-Saxons came in. You can tell that Nettleham is an Anglo-Saxon village because it has ham on the end of its name. You can tell these kinds of things of when a village was set up, estimate just by the name. Although it was likely set up towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, closer to the year 1000. And for the people back then, the village of Nettleham would have been minuscule in comparison to today. A village of 4,000 people back in those days would have been considered big enough to be a city, as back then 90% of the population lived in the countryside. And for the people living here, their experience would probably have been very similar to the vast majority of people who lived in the countryside. That of being a peasant, living in the countryside and working in agriculture for almost your entire life, with the village being the centre of this activity. All these peasants would not own the land that they worked on. The land itself would be owned by a landlord who would extract rents from the peasants for working on said land. However, that landlord did not necessarily completely own the land, but may have leased the land from a noble above him, and such things may work up in a chain with one noble above another until you get to the Earl or even the King. During the Anglo-Saxon period, England was not completely united for most of it, with there being powerful regional kingdoms like Wessex, Northumberland, along with the intervention of the Vikings every now and then. However, by the end of the Anglo-Saxon period, approaching the year 1000, England was united, first by the Anglo-Saxons, and then the Vikings took over for a bit, and then the Anglo-Saxons took over again, until all of that was wiped away by the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, who took over England in 1066. The importance of William taking over the country cannot be understated. He essentially removed the entire almost the entirety of the Anglo-Saxon nobility from top to bottom, and redistributed the land to his own nobles and knights. And this would change England in very important ways, but more important to Lincolnshire and Nettleham specifically. He gave a lot of land over to the church. Now, the church back in those days was powerful and important in ways that we can't quite comprehend in today's day and age. On the local level, there was very little distinction between religious practice and just generally being a part of society. Our modern idea that religion is an individual, personal choice would be deeply alien to those people of that day and age. To be a Christian was to be a part of society, which is one of the reasons why people were so keen to get their children, their babies, baptised as soon as possible. Not just the belief that if they didn't, a baby would go straight to, not be able to go to heaven, but also baptism acted as your membership into society, which is of course which is one of the reasons why Jewish people in this time period were extremely ostracized from society. All of this means that on the local level, the church had immense amounts of power and sway over society. But on a wider scale, in terms of the concerns of the nobility and the king, they also had an immense amount of power because they owned land. At that time period, wealth and power came from the land that you owned. And when William the Conqueror conquered England, he gave a hell of a lot of land to the church. And as the people who ran the church were some of the most educated people around, and the fact that all of this land was somewhat unified under one institution, it meant an immense amount of wealth could be extracted from it. It meant that whoever the church officials were immensely powerful people within England. Frustratingly to the king and other nobles, because of the way that the church worked, it made things more complicated. The wealth and power from the land was extracted by the bishops, but when a bishop died or retired, a new bishop had to be appointed, instead of it going to the bishop's children. This caused immense amounts of conflict between the King of England and the church back in Rome over whom should appoint these bishops. Particularly if the Pope in Rome and the king disagreed. They would both not want people loyal to the other person, holding immense amounts of power and wealth and land. But getting back to Nettleham specifically, the whole country was divided up into dioceses, and the diocese that Nettleham was a part of was the largest in all the country, going from the Humber all the way to the River Thames, with its central capital at Lincoln, not too far away from here. This made this diocese one of the most rich and powerful out of any in the country, and that can be shown over in the city of Lincoln, where they built great monuments to God. And here we are at the church. This church is the same church that was built all those years ago back in Anglo-Saxon times. The main body of the church is likely original, though everything else, including the tower itself, was added on much later, with it continually being improved and renovated all the way up until today. The graveyard here has many old graves, though the oldest I believe is from 1732, of a young boy who was murdered just outside the village. The reason why many of these graves do not go further back than the 18th century is due to the fact that in the 18th and 19th century, with the rapid growth in population and the rapid growth in the urban population from industrialization, urban centres became immensely more populated, and as a result there was need for more space in graveyards. So older graveyards had new graves placed on top of them. This continues with the massive graveyard out this way. Though these graves are from, the older ones are from the 1940s. With us getting progressively newer as we head along. Whilst that cross back there may look like a war memorial, it isn't the actual war memorial. The actual war memorial is down in the centre of town. They also built the school next to the graveyard. Here we are at the end of the graveyard, with much more space still to be filled. They've also extended the path off that way, for when eventually they'll need even more space. But out this way is perhaps the most important thing about the village, and the reason why I was going on about the church so much. As I mentioned, this village is very close to the city of Lincoln, which is the centre for the bishop who ruled this diocese. It makes sense, therefore, that he would need a house, or a palace, for somebody befitting his status. And so here we are. It's all just a big field with a bunch of lumps in it now, but back in the day, this was the residence of the Bishop of Lincoln. This area that I'm currently walking through now, that has been turned into a lovely sort of meadow, previously would have been the area where a number of different animals may have been kept, including pigs. I know this not only because there's a sign next to it, but also because a couple of years ago I did an archaeological excavation in the area. Because I went to that school over there, and in about year 5, they decided that we would go and do some archaeological stuff and get the children to come and help. They of course wouldn't let us do it on the area over there, since all that is protected, but this isn't. And so we dug up stuff. I remember on the very last day when my dad came along to help, we found a whole pig bone, like a jaw from a pig. That was very exciting. I remember, because our square that we dug was right here. However, this was not always a palace for the Bishop of Lincoln. It was originally built as a manor for the Anglo-Saxon Queen Edith. A short time after William the Conqueror conquered England, Edith died, and so the land and the manor was returned back to the crown. Later kings of England then gave this manor to the Bishop of Lincoln as a place where he could live, and hence it became the Bishop's Palace. It was also the place where, if the king was visiting Lincoln, he would often stay, since it had rooms and facilities fit for a queen. It also had rooms and facilities fit for a king. And that leads on to perhaps the most important aspect of the Bishop's Palace. Not just that the kings of England stayed here at certain points, but also that in 1301 it was here that Edward I decreed that his son would be the Prince of Wales. Now that has an immense amount of significance for the political history of England, not only because the Prince of Wales is a position that is still held to this day, but because it was immensely important for the political development of the country. Previous to this, whenever a king died, his sons would almost immediately start fighting each other over who exactly got the best bits of land, with all sorts of Game of Thrones style backstabbing and such. To fix this problem, Edward I decided to appoint a co-king. Essentially, his first male heir would have the title Prince of Wales, because by that time England had conquered Wales. This meant that there was a designated successor already available. So if the king died, that person was already designated to be his heir. This would help to stabilise the succession for a bit, although not entirely, since massive civil wars would still happen over such successions, which together is known as the War of the Roses. Besides those kingly stuff, of course, the Bishop of Lincoln continued to use this as his residence for hundreds of years. In the 16th and 17th century, this began to change, along the lines of the wider religious changes happening in England. Henry VIII, in 1536, broke with the Church in Rome and made the Church in England, and resolved all those disputes with the Pope by essentially making himself the Pope of the Church in England. Now, the position of head of the Church and the king of the country were now inhabited by the same person, and would be up until today. This, however, wasn't universally accepted. A lot of people were understandably dismayed at the reformation of what had been for centuries a fairly consistent way of life that was now being reformed. Particularly, a lot of people were concerned with the abolition of the monasteries, fearing that their local churches might be next. And not unlike today, one little conspiracy theory, ballooned into an existential threat. This, in combination with the 16th and 17th century being a time of immense population growth and stress on resources and even famine later on, meant that the general population felt desperate. And in desperate times, there was only one thing that they could do to make their voices heard: rebel. And so they rebelled in the Lincolnshire Rising of 1536. This rising was put down pretty quickly, but the leaders of that rising escaped elsewhere and started an even bigger revolt in Yorkshire, the whole series of events being called the Pilgrimage of Grace. During these chaotic events in the northeast, the bishop's palace was damaged, and maybe due to this, and along with other factors resulting from the Reformation, this palace was steadily abandoned by the bishops, though they technically still own the land. By the time the English Civil War rolled around, the bishop's palace was completely abandoned. After the parliamentarians had won, they sold the land that this was on for about £2,000. However, once the king had been restored to power in 1660, the land was returned to the Church of England. However, by this time the site had been completely abandoned. A little later on, in the 18th century, the Bishop of Lincoln began construction of a new residence, a new bishop's palace in Lincoln, right next to his cathedral. It is possible that some of the stones from this original bishop's palace were moved over to the new bishop's palace and reused. What definitely happened as part of the construction of a new bishop's palace is that the stones were very much taken and used by the residents of the continually growing village of Nettleham. Many of the stones that were once part of this bishop's palace are now likely part of the houses all across the village. Around this time also, to help with the construction of new houses, a limestone quarry was constructed, which is the most interesting feature of what is left of the bishop's palace. Much of those stones were used to build more houses in the village. Although the picture that they used on the informational boards at the entrance to this site are a little misleading, as they show the limestone quarry being used at the same time as the bishop's palace being in full use. And that was that for this site for a very long time. So unfortunately, I lost the footage after this point. And so instead you'll have me in the voiceover and a video of my cat. As I was saying, the site was left abandoned for about 200 years, until 2012, when the parish council brought the lease for the land off of the Church of England. They then proceeded to do a few little renovations, putting some signs up and some wooden entrances, so that you today can also visit the site and walk in the footsteps of kings and the bishops of England. However, whilst the 18th century marked the end of the story for the bishop's palace, it did not mark the end of the story for the village of Nettleham, whose population, and therefore significance, would only grow. But I will save that for the topic of part 2. But until the next time, I'll see you later.